value something in the world, it signifies that. So you also, Jamie, talked about how what these postmodern thinkers like Derrida, Foucault, Judith Butler are saying is not that language is therefore groundless and sort of has no order to it, but that there is some ordering, that it's just more, it's more expressive and rhythmic than it is fixed and based on designation. So maybe my etymology is completely off. I'm curious to hear your opinion about that, but I just felt like it was an interesting correlation thinking about meaning is planetary, so that it wanders, but it's still rhythmic. You can find the order versus meaning is astral or sidereal, where it's fixed and eternal, based on like essences or ethos. So whichever you want to jump in first.
Well, I guess you talked about accidental to possibly the cetus sound. The word that comes to mind is catastrophe. That people used to think that catastrophe was related because it has aster, catastrophe, but it actually doesn't. It actually comes from strophe, meaning sight. So anyway, I think it's difficult. I think it's interesting to stretch with the letters, the words, but I think the etymology is tough to stretch a little bit.
Yeah.
But specifically, Owen Barfield, I think, has a great way of explaining meaning, and I think we talked about this before, about how he believes there are two different types of meanings. There's the kind that people make up on purpose, where a given meaning where they just say, this is the new thing that just got created, I'm going to name it science, or whatever. And then there's the type of meaning where it just slowly changes. I think that's what's so fascinating about language, is that we haven't, most of the words we haven't fixed and said this is what it means. And yet, when you look at the etymology, like the true meaning, etymology of etymology is true meaning. When you look at that being the original definition and the definition now, so like which words have stayed the same to their etymology and which ones haven't, I think would be another kind of interesting question about the way that the meanings change. So not specifically just that the meanings change, but which words meanings change is another piece of that.
Yeah, there was a bunch of stuff that came up when you were saying that. I guess the one, and I hope I'm remembering right what he said, is just this concept of language games in itself, that that it's not just that they're open, but the game in itself connotes that there are rules and structures, and really what I don't know if Wittgenstein is considered postmodern, maybe, but for Wittgenstein and Derrida and Butler, they all really stress the importance of the scene, that it's really about being present to what the interactions are in the moment. Butler talks about that there is no identity until one is presented with the other, and that meeting of the other person requires me to show up with a face. So I don't know if that's specifically, I was reacting more to something that you said at the end. And just and for Wittgenstein, that he's talking about that it's not so much getting rid of these rules of grammar, but it's actually a sensitivity to words. So the sensitivity, I think, requires this idea of presence.
Can I make a follow-up point? Thanks you guys. I'm just reminded, actually, being in this room, studying the Upanishads with Jim Ryan, who's a Sanskritist, and a very skilled one at that, and him constantly pointing out the wordplay, the puns embedded in Sanskrit, this sacred, evocative language, but, they're playing with you, they're fucking with you a lot of the time too. But I think it's really interesting that it's like etymological non-dualism, because there's always more than one meaning present. So I just, I liked where you went. I thought that was imaginative.
Yeah.
unintended pun for your dissertation, but yeah, and I felt myself like feel a little defensive, as skillful as your analysis of Stern is, because it's part of the alleged etymology of my last name, which is Stearns. And of course, I prefer the stars as opposed to Stern.
It still means star in German, don't worry.
Yeah, so I don't know, I guess, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that, but I guess it just poses the question, like, can we ever really identify a singular etymology, or should we be doing that? Especially if one of our most sophisticated and spiritual languages, Sanskrit, is, so full of non-duality.
Yeah, I can definitely respond. I mean, what comes to mind for me, I'm sure there's a lot of directions to go with that question. I think it's a really big, important question in probably all of philosophy, not just philosophy and language. But I guess just taking Derrida's posture and say, no, that we can't identify this stable etymology. And I think one, because as Butler points out, that there is never presence to the originary moment. We only ever know something in retrospect. So we can never kind of return to that source. And then I think to Derrida's point of the constitutive other, that there is no such thing as pure form and boundary, but that boundaries are always also constructed by the other. And also Derrida, related to that is Derrida's theory of trace. And so if we have this one thing, so he kind of goes back to the originary moment, and when we have this one thing, then it becomes two differentiated things, that there's always the trace of the other within the essence of the other thing. So that they're always, essence is always kind of dirty. I just like to say dirty.
Yeah.
Dirty.
As a follow-up to that, I wondered if the two of you had ever considered some of Derrida's language use as doing some of these things that Barfield suggested. Like Barfield traces Yuma to a spiritual source and to a sort of mechanical air, and then he sees the splitting that goes on over history. And Derrida creates neologisms like pharmacon, that's both poison and remedy, or supplement, something that's extra but also something that completes. I feel like Derrida is trying to take words and do this thing that does bring these sort of double meanings back into language, and could be kind of answer to Barfield.
I think that poison. Yeah, I was trying to remember that word earlier, pharmacon. But I think that's kind of where I'm trying to go with that, is the enchantment of language. Is at least noticing that exists at all. I mean, I think there's lots of different etymologies for lots of different words, but the fact that to even look at language in that imaginative way is what I think just re-enchants. It's like our way of participating in the world is through language. So if we can enchant our participation in any way, I think is useful. Not necessarily, I think etymology is just one small way that we can do it.
Yeah, it's funny.
No, it's exciting for me to hear these two presentations next to each other, because I feel like Barfield and Derrida seem worlds away on the surface, but really it's cool to see these connections.
Yeah, when you said that, it just reminded me of a lost thought from months ago when we were talking about this, and I think whatever happened, the conversation just went somewhere else, and I was never able to articulate that thought and follow it, but it is really interesting, and also in what I didn't get into in my writing, but when Socrates goes into who created the words, and he comes up with the idea of it's the lawgiver that creates the words, and then it's the teacher that decides their proper use. I wanted to kind of look into, well, what does it mean for somebody like Derrida, who is creating words, and how does that fit into Socrates' scheme of the lawgiver? And then deeper into that, it's really interesting because Socrates talks about the lawgiver, but he's specifically talks about, I'm not going to recall his name, but it was a Spartan lawgiver, the man who's credited with creating Spartan law. And the interesting connection is that, as we know, Socrates supposedly never wrote anything. And this lawgiver that he really emulates, Spartan law was not written. It was explicitly an unwritten law. And so there's this emulation of the unwritten, which would, I think, also like wants to like pull me into a whole other study of what does the unwritten mean. But kind of comes back to, so the idea of not writing something down again brings us into this idea of presence. And for Socrates, it is always open. So whereas on the surface, you know, someone like Derrida and Barfield would seem really apart on the surface, certainly Derrida and Socrates seem very far apart since Derrida is critiquing Aristotle and Socrates and Aristotle are different, but in the context of Derrida's critique, he's critiquing something that they both share. But they're both kind of Socrates' idea of the unwritten law really goes back into this idea of language games and the continual play and the idea of presence, and the question is always open, and then you always ask the question again and again, and it's always exploratory. So.
Hi. I wasn't sure if I was going to ask. Well, I have two questions for you. And the first one is related to what you were both just talking about. So I'm not trying to make myself sound smart. I just read this like 2 days ago. So like the word Jupiter, if you break up Jew and picture, it means the light, or the light of day, or the light of heaven, and it also means father. So in a weird way, this word Jupiter means our Father who art in heaven. It's the beginning of it. And so you have that as the sort of merging of these two words. But then as it grows into our time, in a sense, Jupiter is, as we see it now, is a child of these two words. And it sort of grows up and then disinherits its parents and leaves all that behind, and we don't remember it, right? So you just said this thing about etymology being one way to engage with words. But I find that that seems to happen a lot, where when we try to cultivate meaning when we encounter a word or language, our first instinct is to go to the past. And what would it mean if, like, with everybody we met, we always judge them on their parents or where they came from, or what, you know, like the people that combined to make this person, but didn't allow it to have its own identity in our time. So I'm wondering what a vision of engaging with a word without, not that I prefer this, it's just a question, without going back in time would mean to just meet it now. And you sort of talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about it. And then the second question is much harder to answer. So let's see if you can.
And then I'll decide if I want to ask you the second one or not.
No.
I don't know. You know, I feel like I've been so inundated in the idea of etymology and how that can show relationships and enchant us. And I think the biggest piece of what I'm trying to show is that through etymology, we get images a lot more often. And so there is this way that you can kind of bridge this part of yourself instead of just being very mechanical with language to actually have an image. So just now when I think of Freya, I think of the goddess or the cat because it holds such a different meaning for me. Or now when I hear desire, I don't just think of like me wanting something. It's like I actually can imagine the stars, like giving that information. So I guess I haven't thought of other ways to really enchant with language other than for me the past, I guess. Maybe that's very Saturnian, Jupiterian, fatherly of me, but I don't know.
Yeah, I guess so. The one thing is, I was going to read this quote earlier, but it didn't seem to fit. This is from Gertrude Stein and her essay, What Are Masterpieces? She said, the thing one gradually comes to find out is that one has no identity when one is in the act of doing anything. Identity is recognition. You know who you are because you and others remember anything about yourself, but essentially you are not that when you are doing anything. I am I because my little dog knows me, but creatively speaking, the little dog knowing that you are you, and you're recognizing that he knows, that is what destroys creation. So probably have to read that like a few times, even though that's a really clear, for you know, this is an explanatory essay from Gertrude Stein, so you can imagine how her creative work doesn't necessarily lend itself to being understood immediately. And so the other thing that came to mind for me is so this idea of like what happens when we come to the scene of encounter and we have a predisposed idea of who somebody is and what that calls out in the other person. And so two things, or a few things. So one is to kind of what happens when we delve into the world of nonsense and really tolerate ambiguity a little more instead of always having to label this or this and know who you are. But it definitely requires a bit of being able to kind of wade in the unknowing. And then the other thing that came to mind is the etymology of the word respect. And spect is related to seeing and viewing, and to see again. So to respect isn't really a set of rules, but in the etymological way, it means to see again. So it means that every time I'm presented with you, I will see you again, and I'll see you again, and I'll see you again. And so you have this ability to kind of show up continually in different and creative ways.
Yeah, I really like that. Because I was just thinking as you said that, like, what if I met somebody named Adolf or like Sally Mae? Yeah. It would be really difficult, so you have to do this thing where you're constantly letting go. Yeah, it's really, with the names of people, that becomes very clear, what you just said. So then my other question is, so I mean, in both of your talks, there's this sense in which language has a special place, but then I do wonder, why should it be special at all? Why should we take this stance of giving so much privilege to it in human experience? I mean, it seems like well, it's obvious, but not really if I think about it. And then hearing these two talks side by side makes me think like, oh, we're really trying to like sink into this and pull it apart, and then it becomes so special because we do that work. But why in the first place? Not that I think it's not or is. I just want maybe to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, why language? Why are we talking about language?
I mean, I can say a few things with language. So I mean, there's the conception of the human as the speaking animal. So there's definitely is this like really intimate tie between the human and humans' use of language. And another thing that kind of comes to mind, which was one of the reactionary essays to the dialogue in my thesis, was really kind of playing with the ideas that are coming out of speculative realism and this idea of democratizing objects. So if we actually view language as an object among other objects, then what does it look like? And if we play with the speculative idea and kind of let our imaginations go, or when I do, what I came up with is, well, what if language, what if it's just like a being, a species, like any other species that we interact with, and humans are in a symbiotic relationship with it, then what does it look like? So it's kind of taking on that, going into like Thacker's view of what would it look like when we look at things without a human lens. Maybe it would look like that. Not satisfied with that one?
I'm just thinking about it.
Damn it.
Done.
Did not take long.
Well, I was thinking about Ernest Cassirer, the animal symbolicum. That's what he calls humans, the animal symbolicum. The animal who makes symbols. And I think I can only answer that question from a personal level. Like, why was I interested, at a personal level, diving into language? And for me, it's just always been one of those strange things where, well, first of all, I was spelling bee champion in 6th grade. So that's mostly why I think I like language so much. But secondly, it's mostly that I notice like how much language influences me all the time, and I can't help but be like changed and curious about it. And when I see a word, I'm always looking for what word is in that word. It's almost like this weird game I play all the time, where I see the word bus and I see us, or I see, you know, I see star and I also see tar, and I see all the other words that are always contained within every word. And so it just, I'm constantly curious about why language just like grabs me in a way where you could just play with language all the time. I think for me, I'm pulled to it because it's playful, like the way that Shannon said, with puns. When I was a TV reporter, I always used puns. Like I couldn't write a story without a really good pun, because what was the point of speaking language and talking about something if you weren't going to play with language to engage with it? So I think I can only really answer that question from a personal perspective. I don't know that much otherwise. Let me speak to my personal experience.
I'm so glad that you presented together. It's great to hear your thesis and anti-thesis together, and it's giving me a lot of food for thought. I just wanted to make a comment that someone whose work I'm deeply devoted to as a hobbyist in the way that you've described it, Jamie, and hoping to take this interest out of the realm of just hobby, but as I think you know, Tolkien was a close friend of Owen Barfield's. They were in the literary group, the Inklings, together, and he was also a philologist. And his process in creating worlds, and your quote from Hitler fascinates me, because his process in creating a mythology was through language. So he began by creating languages. He invented 14 languages, and they would just kind of come through him, and it was as the language formed that his worlds would then come alive. So the language came first, the names came first, and then the people came to life. And what is that but not enchantment, and coming through in these as a bridge to an undiscovered world. So and he was very influenced by, I think they kind of co-influenced each other, Barfield and Tolkien. For example, the ideas that Barfield expresses in Poetic Diction of how words splinter. He basically gives life to that in how the different groups of peoples in his world splinter into different communities and cultures and so on. So he very much adopted that. Anyway, just wanted to throw
I think
that out
that's
there.
where language gets really confusing, though, is that, you know, was it really that the language was created first? And my experience at Barfield is really that it was the consciousness that created the language. And so that's always an interesting question about which came first, the chicken or the egg. Was it that our consciousness was a specific way, and so words were formed that way? It's a constant interplay between our consciousness and language. Is it that the language formed the way we spoke? I mean, and I really feel like it was, the language is just reflecting our consciousness. And so as our consciousness is changing, that's why we're looking at language differently. I don't know what, that's always been an interesting question to me, is which came first, the chicken or the egg? And I guess we'll never really know.
I just want to say one thing also to your point. I think it's really interesting that he created the language first, and then the world and the people came into existence, just relating it to like Christian theology, and that it was actually the Word of God breathed the world into existence. And I think back to Philo of Alexandria had 3 different types of logos, and the one was logos prophorikos, and it was seminal logos. It was like related to sperm. It was actually the logos of the word that brought the universe into existence. So it's really interesting.
I was going to follow up on what you just said, Becky, about how you lean more in the direction of thinking consciousness comes first and that the language follows. And I wonder if this is a difference between you. I remember, Jamie, you said at the beginning of your presentation that you thought language is less about the speaker's intention than it is about some autonomous force in the words themselves that have effects in the world that the speaker didn't intend, but that they weren't conscious of in any way. So I'm wondering if maybe you two could hash that out a little bit and see. Tool.
I have my 7-year plan. I don't know. It's funny because I like doing.
I
But
don't have to duel, I mean.
no,
Just respectfully disagree.
like it's really strange. I don't really feel like dueling in this moment. Usually I'm always up for the duel. I don't know. I think that maybe is a difference. And I'm still wrestling with it. I mean, I always think a lot about, you know, in the beginning there was the word, and I sense that, but then also there's something in me that if words are really these kind of divine creations, that it doesn't matter which came first, because then ultimately they came from somewhere else through us. So whether we were conscious, there was consciousness or there's language, it's like if they didn't come from either, then it doesn't really matter. We were just the vessel for bringing them through. Doesn't it? Maybe a certain consciousness made it easier for specific words or more difficult.
Yeah, I think we probably mostly agree. I mean, that's, you know, I don't think that there's an answer. Like you know, whatever I don't even remember what I said that you just repeated. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, to me, it's not. I'm not really interested in finding like, well, did humans create language, or did the Word of God create the earth, or, you know, I just think that it's that one, I don't think we'll ever find an answer to that, and I think that it's fun to kind of travel down all of the different paths and see what kind of things come up.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it's both. You know, there are some examples of someone consciously inventing a word to serve a particular purpose, and there are plenty of examples of sort of accidental mutation of language that just accrues historically. The change meaning accrues historically, and nobody really knows where it came from or why it's there. Which would, you know, language is intentionally, or a word is intentionally created. When it's more credence to your perspective, the consciousness maybe has more to do with it, and then it's more accidental evolution.
When somebody creates a word, how can we actually say what's happening there as well?
Right. And,
you know, I don't want to like get too far into nihilism, or you know, not that that's really nihilism, but I mean, you know, we don't know what. There's probably another view that like when somebody creates a word, that you know, it could be like when the prophet says a new word, it's actually God moving through revealing Himself to the prophet, or the universe revealing itself, or it could be that somebody is creating a word.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, the term Big Bang just came to mind because it was used as a sort of insult to make fun of the theory, and then was later adopted as the name of the theory. So that, yeah, good point.
Yeah, that's true about the Big Bang. It was something like the theory was described to, I think it was to the physicist Gamow, and you can sort of imagine the conversation, sort of the first time this theory is being proposed, and up until now it's thought the universe is kind of infinite and eternal, and Gamow is like, sort of, what, like some kind of Big Bang or something. Kind of funny. But I wanted just to kind of jump in about language and consciousness as well. It's something I've given some thought to, and I mean, I think one thing that immediately strikes me is, well, even harder than language in such a question is consciousness. If language is difficult to kind of pin down, then consciousness is the kind of ultimately troublesome one in that respect. But I sense, particularly from a kind of evolutionary point of view, that a kind of co-evolutionary view is perhaps helpful. That in sort of indeed some kind of idea of a strange loop of two kind of mutually interacting levels, or kind of consciousness prior to language and kind of lingual consciousness, the kind of stuff we do really a lot of the time, as actually mutually constitutive. So as saying which came first is perhaps hard, but then there's possibly kind of a lot of depth in their mutual influence of each other. Because I think as well it's somewhere where I kind of have most difficulty with Jung, I think, is his kind of notion as humans as the first and only ones to make the reflexive statement, and it seems to me that language is, in some level, pretty continuously distributed in evolution, and animals communicate. It's probably fair to say they're not communicating as symbolically as us, but they are communicating, and then what they're communicating is interesting, and a sense like maybe a lot of what they're communicating is what we would term emotions, so perhaps a kind of labeling of emotions is implicated in the inception of language. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling a bit, but those are my thoughts on the interaction of language and consciousness.
I think the co-creation part of it is really where I'm leaning more towards this. It's hard to say which one is where or fits where, but you can notice even today that there's a co-creation of language happening. Especially they say that Plato created the term imagination, is it? And that he was the one, he decided he wanted to change the way that the word was said. And that was this intentional, like, whatever, but somehow through him creating this way, he changed consciousness. So yeah, I think there has to be an intermingling constantly between the consciousness and language, and to say that we can know which one came first, to me, just is really difficult, almost impossible.
But that seems contingent. I mean, I don't know about you, Jamie, but just knowing from talking to you about your thesis, I mean, I wouldn't guess that you would think that we think in words.
No, I don't.
And so that to me would seem to indicate that language stems out of consciousness. So when and that also is Barfield's foundation, is that we don't think in words. So so it would seem to me that consciousness would be primary then in the instance of your thing, but I don't know about Jamie's, because the postmodern people are really obsessed with language, like above all, like, well, especially a lot of the ones that you brought, maybe not Foucault, but the others are obsessed above all with language. It's this constant question, but they're also mostly humanists, secular humanists. I mean, some of them have this weird, like, overlay with a lot of the spiritual stuff that goes on here, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think where the postmodernists, well, Derrida's famously said that there is nothing outside of the text, or something like that. Not so famous in my mind, but I think we don't know anything outside of language. To Aristotle's point, it's not that there is nothing outside of language, but we don't know anything outside of language, because knowing in itself is related to the ability to abstract and repeat within a system, the system of language. So whether, maybe that's granting too much space for them, I'm not quite sure, but this presentation, well, it's I guess in my own personal feelings of it, was that this was more of the hobbyists. It was more of a game for me, and kind of related to these. And what's your name?
Tom.
Tom, what you just said. This idea that maybe humans use language in a little bit different way as other beings. Like, what comes up for me is that, well, it's the earth itself communicating, and if we think about it in terms of the earth itself as a being, then it's not so much that what the human is doing or what other animals are doing, it's how the earth is manifesting in itself, and there's all of these variant ways that we're all manifesting together. So I think ultimately, like, I'm really interested in finding out if there's a way to think about all of these things without even the idea of consciousness, because it, in my mind, always becomes really problematic. And I don't know why exactly, but I just don't like the kind of complication that it adds. But and now I can't remember what I was going to say. That's what happens when you try to think outside of consciousness. But
you lose language.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Use your
that.
words.
It just draws a picture.
Yeah, so I don't think of it, and to me there isn't a question of whether or not the the human invented language and it's a human tool. To me, it's obvious in my mind that the universe invented language and we're interacting with it in particular.
Cool. And that's something.
Sorry.
I mean, I think another part of what Derrida is doing with there's nothing outside of the text is that there's nothing outside of context in general, and that he analyzes language down to this place where it's not even like our typical notion of language anymore. It's like anytime there's signification or sign, you know, even if it's a statue or something, you know, like the context within which that statue is changes its signification and its sense. So sort of excuse me, the dynamics of language are already happening before we're using words and have these typical kind of limbal things. So if you take that sort of wide view of language as sense, I feel like maybe we get back to this place where it doesn't resolve the question in any way, but what you were saying earlier about we were conscious before we start using words. If you take this wide view of language, then maybe you can follow it back and they run parallel.
I agree with the point that we're problematically conscious before we start using words, but I just wanted to get back to this point about the idea that we don't think in words because that's discrepant with my experience. I don't think exclusively in words, but I absolutely am running scripts, narratives in my head throughout the day, and even in dreams. I read in dreams, I write in dreams, so I don't know, maybe I'm particularly mercurial, but I'm just curious, like, you know, where that idea comes from, that we don't think in words.
I think it's more of a gradient. Like there are specific words that I think of as words. Like I was trying to think of it, like the word star. I think most of us, I don't know what other people think of, but usually I just think of a 5-pointed star, like a one-dimensional 5-pointed star. That's what I think of when I think of the word star. But there are specific words that like when I brought up bus. When I think of bus, I actually don't think of the vision of the bus, I think of the word itself. So I think it's mostly that we don't think of the words, but for me, my experience is that specific words I think of in images and specific ones I see in text. And I don't know why that is or what influences that, but that's just
well, so in that case, though, it's your mental representation or response to the stimulus of language.
yeah.
But what about thought content?
Like, do I think in words? Versus, oh, I see mental stimulus.
Without a verbal stimulus.
I do both. I mean,
Yeah.
I think in colors, I think in pictures, I also think in words. I think most people probably have a blend. I'd be curious other people's experience. Do you? Do you think in words or do you think in? Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like a, I don't know, wacky kind of world in there. There's some words, yeah, for sure. It's weird to talk and that.
Just this discussion's been making me think about images and words. So
Have you been thinking about them in images or?
Both. But I think I probably think more in words, but in like I've kind of tried to seek this out quite a lot in conversation and found a really varied response. And then in mathematics, you get a thing of like some people are kind of algebraic thinkers, some people are sort of geometrical thinkers. So I think there's quite a continuum as far as I can. But I sense that like quite a clue about images and words might come from dreaming. Is dreaming, I mean, Hillman makes a big thing of this, but dreaming seems to be somewhere where there's a real preponderance on images. He makes the point that you rarely dream in text, notwithstanding. So maybe you're like, maybe that like he's not right there, or always.
The price of overeducation.
I mean, I know it's very rare for text to come up in my dreams, and when it does, it's like really hard to read and doesn't make any sense. But one thing this thought, I'd just kind of put this out there. This has been sort of itching, I think, as this discussion's going on. I feel it might be kind of significance somehow. A phenomena I've found in dream work is to take a series of dream images that don't immediately make a lot of sense or seem quite strange, really. and write them down. And then I look at the words that I've written down, and because words are multivalent in meaning, you go from the image to words by some mapping, but then through the multivalence of the words, another mapping comes back, and suddenly your dream is made clear by the act of writing it down. And you haven't exactly done a conscious thought process in this. It's just by writing it down. I wish I could think of an example, but I've had like these flashes of revelations about the meanings of dreams just by attempting to put them into words, and then the words give you the meaning back, and it's like it's being done for you. And I think there's a lot of depth in that, and that may be, and it is in a sense possibly like the other direction on the bridge that Becca mentioned. But, yeah, that's to kind of to put out there.
I think it's almost like it's both a remembrance and a creation at the same time.
Yeah.
And I know we only have a minute, and I just realized, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Leo.
Leo,
Yep.
I realized you had your hand up before.
Yeah, I kind of lost it, but I'll try. I mean, you bring up Derrida a lot and the Credulous, but when I think of Derrida and him dealing with language, I really think of the Phaedrus, and then that's his big argument, and that's where the pharmacon that Plato uses comes from. And so that whole argument that Plato makes against writing, and I've kind of heard it, but I haven't heard it said, is when you say language, how much are you thinking of writing, and how much are you thinking of language as, I guess, as autonomous, pre-writing, or enchanted, it's sung in?
Well, that was kind of why I really wanted to make sure that I intertwined the creation of the alphabet with when I was speaking about the different kind of phases of language, because I know there are a lot of people who argue that it was the alphabet that really changed the way that we thought as well, because there's the physical act of writing versus the language that you speak. And yes, I think we all agree they're pretty different. I experienced the writing form and the thinking form as fairly different. But in my experience, that the alphabet is like equally as enchanted as the unwritten, and I think that's really what I was trying to make clear, is that the Sanskrit written form is just as numinous in my experiences when you speak it. Like, it's just magical to look at, and when you speak it, it's the same way. So yeah, I'm really interested though in that difference of experience with the written and the spoken language, because we didn't really talk about which one we were talking about when we first started.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the particular perspective that I was looking into, and I would say writing, it was a specific engagement with philosophical texts, and I can't really speak too much to your question, but I know that there's a concept I haven't explored that much in Derrida, but his idea of phonocentrism, the privileging of the utterance over the written word, and the idea that the utterance came before the written word, and playing with that idea that I would have to look more into. But yeah, it's a very good point. I think we're out of time, and yeah, happy to continue talking over dinner and drinks after this, if we're all invited. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you both.